can just pause the recording sometime.
All right. So I'm very happy to start us off today. This paper on tradability and sectoral productivity differences, joint work with some of our Groningen students, Ryan and Kaira. And the main starting point would be the role of productivity differences in accounting for cross-country variation in GDP work. So these are, we present this in many ways, and they have been presented in many ways. In all these setups, you get to a point where you say, well, if we look at variation in produced and human capital, that's going to do something to account for these income differences, but not all that much. So at the end of the day, we're still left with considerable amount of income variation that's stuffed into the residual. In this particular setup, it's more than 60% of the income variation. And then, of course, the question is, well, is there a way to narrow this down, and is there a way to get us a bit closer to tracking where these differences come from? So what we do, by the title, and of course this conference is going down to a sectoral perspective. And there we have, of course, a great many people that have argued for the importance of various sectors. Those in the Team Zero workshop also had the work by Solvik about construction industry. Over here we have some of the more traditional ones. So Doug's done a lot of work on agriculture. Danny Roderick has been arguing for the importance of manufacturing for development. If you get into your standards, structural change models and investment versus consumption is a key factor. Different services, and of course the traditional Balassa-Samuelson argument of the traded versus non-traded sector. Before getting too much ahead of myself, one of the things that we end up with here is saying that this traded versus non-traded is doing a lot of work, and it's a pretty key distinction to understanding these aggregate productivity differences. Now, of course, just as there are many hypotheses, this is not something that we're the first to address. But at the same time, we think that there's still mileage to go in bringing us, that there's still ways to get us closer. And most of the mileage we feel here is from the measurement side. The theory we're worried about is not new. You want to know about making cross-country comparisons across multiple countries, then some of the theory has been with us for over 40 years. But at the same time, if you look at some of the studies, there's this clear trade-off between the methodological sophistication and country coverage. So recent work by Vadinger and others doing a lot about international and integrated input linkages, but covering about 38 countries, while of course for a development accounting context, we want to cover a much broader range of countries and experiences. Now, of course, people have done that as well, but as we will argue, there are important steps to take to get us to more useful and reliable numbers. So the coverage in this paper is of 84 countries. Those countries are somewhat richer than the world average. And as you can imagine, if you're looking at the blank spots in Africa, that's where a lot of the lower income people are living, as well as the slaves of Central Asia. Inequality is a bit is also smaller than in the global sample, but at the same time, the role of these TFP differences in accounting for variation in GDP per worker, that's pretty similar. So if you would single out the countries in our sample in this figure, you wouldn't this wouldn't be a very particular group of countries that we've isolated and that we're analyzing in the remainder of this paper. Now, what we do, and this is enabled by the financial support from the STEC project. What we do in this paper is to develop new measures of relative prices, power parities, and we do that for at the sectoral level for gross output, intermediate inputs, and value added. 84 countries, as mentioned, 12 sectors, and for 3 recent years in which there was a global price comparison from the International Comparison Project. What we then, of course, take that to a development accounting context and look at relevant combinations of sectors, and that gives us this distinction between traded and non-traded. But as we'll show, that there's more into that as well. And importantly, we also show how these improvements in our measurement shift the results. And there, I'm also going to say that in particular the fact that we have employment data, actual numbers of workers, employees, and self-employed in these different sectors is a key thing to move us closer to where we think these sectoral productivity numbers ought to be. So let me spend a little more on this and to highlight where we think the literature was before we get started and what we add to that. And what's too bad that Akos Valentini isn't here, because he's done work with Bertolt to highlight this previous approach. Mostly then looking at final expenditure prices from the ICT, assuming efficient allocation of resources across sectors. So assuming the price and is all the same across the factory inputs, and having a single Cobb-Douglas production function covering all countries. What we put in is prices for sectoral outputs in value-added terms, employment data. We have a more flexible functional form, and although we don't dispense with this efficient capital allocation for much of our baseline numbers, we can show that making this adjustment seems to be less of a factor, seems to be less important than dealing with the labor side of the measurements. Now, the measurement framework itself is not very exciting from a conceptual perspective. As mentioned, the theory on this is not new. So we have our productivity as a ratio of output over input. Our output is deflated nominal numbers, and the key thing there is purchasing power parities, PPPs. And the real inputs are an aggregate of the factor inputs. Using factor shares, and for Cobb-Douglas, it would just be a single output elasticity. Here we use multi-country factor income shares. We have 84 countries, so we want to make a sound. Sorry. We want to make a sound comparison across all these multiple countries relative to the United States. As said, one of the key things here is moving to a value-added price concept. And again, this is not conceptually a major step forward, but organizing this material is quite an undertaking. I can assure you. We're measuring direct prices where it's possible in agriculture and mining. We're still relying on the prices from the international comparison projects. What they do is they survey consumer and investment prices across nearly all countries in the world. But these are, of course, final expenditure prices, consumer prices, purchaser prices. So we have to make adjustments to get them to a producer price concept. So that means adjusting for differences in distribution margins, producer product taxes, and to account for the fact that what you spend money on is partly on imported products, and it omits products that are exported. So also having to adjust for differences in import and export prices at the sectoral level. Final step is then to say, oh, well, but we have prices for the output of a sector. We also want to adjust for differences in intermediate inputs. And for that, we use supply use tables. Again, for those in the P0 workshop, I'd say the Vries and his colleagues have done quite a bit of work on getting more supply use tables for our countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we supplement that by similar data for Asia, from the OECD in the Trade and Value Added database. And that's overall lets us make this this measurement of intermediate input prices and get us to value added. Now, again, this is not something that will set everybody's hearts racing, but I think the fact that we're able to cover this and we're able to move forward on this is helping to lay a solid foundation for what comes after. Now, just to give some impression of what these numbers then lead us to. So this is about price variation, not yet productivity. And what we show here is the relative price. So PPPs over the exchange rate, where the one indicates that we're at a low of one price. Top row, the yellow bar, the orange bar is for the total economy. That's the well-known fact that on average, countries with lower income levels tend to have lower prices. After Samuelson. If we then look across sectors, you'll see first the most non-traded services, construction, government, real estate. At the other end, you have the goods sector, mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. They tend to be around the law of one price. So of course, it's not just the median that's in the bars, but of course there's quite a bit of variation around this median as well. So there's a systematic patterns across sectors, but there's also quite a bit of variation within sectors. Quite important for Constraint, you see quite a bit of other sectors somewhat in the middle here.
What does it mean for construction to be cheaper than agriculture? Is that like they didn't have a choice in units at some level?
Well, it means that a construction project will be relatively cheaper than because you're using a lot of local labor. While for agriculture, and you'll have to pay a price close to the exchange rate. Does that make sense?
Is it 2017 yet, or
So
which year are you?
this is across these 3 years, so 2005, 11, and 17. Yeah.
Nice.
Sorry?
You have comment on this huge.
Huge dispersion in utilities. Yeah, so that's clearly a striking one. This could well, so what may well be going on here are taxes, and that's and adjusting for tax differences tends to be a bit imperfect. We might have to do a bit more work here to figure out, well, whether we can do more to adjust for that. It's also a difficult sector, I guess, in the sense that trade is very much imperfect there. So the average is close to 1, but yeah, sitting next to the bus with Doug and saying, yeah, in the northeast of the US, electricity is quite expensive, and yeah, that's. And that doesn't seem to be quite as much related to development levels as some of the other segments.
What it is in a certain year, the US is 1 for all of these, but either also the relative to the US.
Yeah. No, that's a good. Thank you. That's a good clarification. So all of these, the US is equal to 1. So so that means that since most countries are not as rich as the US, you'll see that prices are lower in the lower income countries, or at the total economy level and maybe in services, but not so much in traded sectors. So that's on our output side. And on the input side, on the factory inputs, a big step is the employment data from the economic transformation database. So again, I'm pointing to Heights, who's done a lot of work on with his team on constructing these, Callum as well, and relying on census data across many of these across these countries, mixing that with labor force surveys and trying to get reliable benchmark numbers, reliable time series. Hell of an undertaking, and we're glad that they did that. And that's, yeah, that gets us, allows us to get to these 84 countries with the data. So that's the big data collection measurement part, and as mentioned, that's important for these results. On the capital side, we're mostly following the work by Berthold and Abosch, assuming constant things across sectors. So for human capital, we assume the same level of schooling across sectors. For produced capital, we assume efficient capital allocation. For land, also, we assume that's efficient. Now, of course, it's going to be violated, and probably to a non-trivial extent. But yeah, we hope that, well, we've got to leave something for whoever comes out. Another thing is factor income shares. Ever since Doug showed that there's not much systematic variation in labor shares across countries, everybody's been pretty comfortable in following that assumption. Some measurement work in getting us actual figures for that, and we're exploiting that data to say, okay, well, that if we know there's an aggregate level of labor share, that means there's a total amount of labor income this can be distributed across sectors. And we also know that sectors' income should add up to value added. So through an iterative process, we estimate sectoral labor shares. So what we show here is abbreviated 12 sectors a bit. So here we have labor, capital, and land shares, and the red range is the interquartile range. So I'm not going to go through this chart in detail, but you see things like, well, for instance, agriculture all the way on the left is quite land intensive as it should be, but also that the factor income share going to land shows quite a bit of variation across countries. In lower income countries, these labor income share, land income shares tend to be higher than in rich countries. And so there's quite some variation that comes in by this estimation process. Again, you can do more, but this is a way of at least allowing for that variation to take place. Similarly, labor is mostly the most has the highest share for most sectors, but again, quite some variation around those averages as well. Second bits of what we show here are relative marginal products of labor. So the marginal product of labor is then the average labor productivity times the output elasticity, here assumed to be the labor income share. And then you can compare each sector's marginal products of labor to the economy-wide marginal product of labor. And if efficient labor allocation held, then all of these would be equal to 1. And what we show here is the median relative marginal product of labor across all countries in a given sector. And we see that they're very far from 1. So in line with the work of Doug and others, the relative marginal product of labor in agriculture is quite a bit lower than 1. If we look at finance, wages tend to be quite high in a way that's hard to reconcile. This moving away from this efficient labor allocation is quantitatively quite an important step. So this gives us all the different pieces. So you have relative value added, you have factor inputs that gets us to productivity. And what we do to look at this variation is to estimate versions of this equation. So here we're asking to what extent does sectoral productivity systematically vary with the level of GDP per worker. Again, Berthold and Akos also went this route to summarize this. That's a bit different from what you would do if you'd say, well, what's the variation across countries? And that can be large or small, but here we're looking at, okay, do we see that low-income countries tend to have low productivity, while high-income countries have high productivity? Now, if we look at this figure here, then agriculture, this holds quite clearly. So as countries grow richer, agricultural productivity tends to rise. If we look at some of if we look at dwellings, that's not the case. Now, dwellings is a bit of a odd industry in a ways, but also for say government services, you don't get as much of a variation across countries as you do in agriculture. Manufacturing is also smaller. So these are the gammas that tell us something. So then we're looking at different groupings of these 12 sectors. So basically saying, okay, to what extent do we see similar patterns across sectors with certain characteristics? So you can compare agriculture to non-agriculture, or manufacturing to non-manufacturing, consumption versus investment sectors. There are some of these differences. So as you can see, agriculture, gamma is much higher than for the other sectors. But what we found particularly striking is if you look at traded versus non-traded, you get, we actually get that the non-traded productivity that is not systematically varying in GDP per worker, while the traded sectors is. That depends a little on how you define traded or non-traded actually. So we looked at different indicators, export shares, import shares, also things like people in international trade have looked at things like to what extent are within, say, the United States, is local demands supplied by local supply, or to what extent are there big differences between who is supplying a particular good or products, and that too tells you that it's not just the traditional goods producing industries like agriculture or manufacturing that are traded across distances, but also some of the services. So finance, business services, even the wholesale trade is that's a big factor in facilitating the movement of products. So if we look at this, either this narrow or this broad definition, you get quite some variation. Well, if we look at the non-traded sectors, governments, utilities, construction, there's no systematic variation. Again, that doesn't mean there's no variation. These productivity differences can be very large, but these are not systematically correlated with the level of GDP per worker. Now, and that gets us to, basically back to Balassa Samuelson, also to Baumol, who also said that, who emphasized that there's these stagnant sectors where productivity growth is very hard, but also mentioned that there are some services where productivity growth is actually quite possible and can be rapid. So I'm not going to go through these extensions, but I'll mention them. If we, so the nice thing of doing improved measurement is that you can then make these data worse and see where the changes happen. And that mostly happens when you start to assume efficient labor allocation again. So that was certainly a key improvement over existing practice. For about half the sample, we have also sectoral capital stock data, and so we can test some of the sensitivities. That changes a little. You might worry about that some of these sectoral cross-country productivity levels may be problematic or iffy, or the data are hard for government and construction. I'll certainly agree with that. But this distinction between traded and non-traded also seems to work quite well in the time series context. So in our paper, we look at specifically data for the US over the longer term, and there too, the traded services show similar productivity growth as the goods sector, excluding ICT. ICT is in a league of its own. Some of the work by Sang-Min Lee has also shown that this holds in a broader set of countries as well. So that gives us some further support that this traded and non-traded distinction is quite important, and that accounting for the tradability of different services sectors makes quite a bit of a difference here. Now, of course, that still leaves questions on the table that we at least haven't found a convincing answer. And so what is it about whether we label it or whether we deem it to be tradable that seems to make these sectors conducive to productivity growth? So Danny Roderick in his premature deindustrialization paper argues that there are particular features of the manufacturing sector that are conducive for development, the ability for returns to scale, innovative activities, but yeah, whether that's how that translates to some of these tradable services is less clear at this moment, and yeah, so that's something that we haven't found an answer for. The other one is that, as with any development accounting, we're looking at past development paths. So what has allowed countries to become much richer? Well, that seems to be productivity growth in the traded sector. But to what extent does that path still hold for lower income countries? And that's an open question. Looking at things like productivity convergence tells us something to what extent these trends are currently still taking place. But that too is something that we leave on the table for further work. So thank you all. I think we first have our discussions.
So I guess first I just want to say that I'm a big fan of yes, I'm a big fan of the work that Rob and his colleague and the GGBC has done. I think we all owe them a thanks and promise. So those data are the first one. First one, the nine courses, force my students to be familiarized with the data. So I think these are very important work. This is the newest endeavor that they have. Let me just so Rob has gone through quite the paper quite carefully. So I'm just quickly summarize what they do and kind of try to relate it to the literature. So the paper provides new estimates of cross-country sector level productivity differences using new data, and in particular, so they construct detailed data on both input and output prices, and they also have country sector specific. So I don't pretend I know all those index numbers and all those accounting methods. So let me just first summarize the results. Now comment about the question I have about some of the results, and then I will also talk about how to use the measurement and whether the way that they look at the TFT variations, whether there could be a better way to look at it, and for some of the variables, whether there could be other alternative ways to come out with better measurement. So first, let me kind of relate to the literature. So because whenever there's a new estimate come up, I'm always very nervous. Right? So the things that we have been working on, the facts that we build our models on, are they still true with the new measurement? Right? So with this new round of measurement of the sectoral particular differences, there are facts that's confirmed. For example, the large agricultural particular gap. So I want to mention that they measure it in real terms, and so using the PV price, so that you can show in the graph that the agricultural stands out, right? So the agricultural particularity, value-added particularity, relative to the aggregate value-added particularity, so the median is 0.252, right? So I think Docs paper is 41, around 41. So the and what also Robert mentioned again, control for some of the input differences, human capital. So that result, I think it seems to be quite consistent with the literature. So, which is good because I've been working on this agricultural gap. So that fact is still remains. And they also confirm this long-standing assumption. I guess first suggested by Balas and Samuelson is that there's large particular differences in tradable sector, but small particular differences in non-tradable sector. And there's a high overlap between non-tradable and the traditional sector that Julieta and Lucia looked at. So these are the kind of two important facts that seem to remain with this new round of estimation. Now, but we also raised some questions about some other well-known facts. Right? So the first is this Xian and Caunedo's paper about various parties of investment, where they show that the price of investment goods is pretty constant across. And so based on that, they find that the majority of time who would observe the capital output ratio difference across countries, you need a large particular difference in the investment production sector, the sector for producing investment goods. And yet, but what and also from the teams early that will also find that. But what they find is the opposite. Now the investment particularly is very small across countries than consumption. And part of the reason I look at it and try to understand, it seems that the price is also very small now, the investment group, the very positive investment group. So that makes me kind of surprised in a sense because I saw the investment group, this kind of, I remember this paper by Eden Porter in 2001, which shows that all the investment goods, I mean equipment, is produced by 7 countries. And so it used to be OECD countries. And now you have 7 countries, maybe you don't have Taiwan, now you have Taiwan, not a country, region, but now you have China, mainland China. So I would think about the capital goods has still much closer to PPP, and with all the globalizations, and you look at it, it's not up to the trade war, right? So this is still looking at that period, that there's more price variations. So that makes me curious what happened. But I guess your capital investment included structure. So that maybe because the housing price has a lot of changes in recent years. So maybe mostly driven by the structure. I thought that would be interesting to kind of divide that. If you given that you're in the spirit of doing things more disaggregated. I think dividing equipment and production, I think would be very good. That kind of also related to the trading material. So that's one issue that that's not considered with the literature. And the second is that this large particular difference in manufacturing. So in a way, I always thought that could be a potential reason for us to understand why poor countries don't import more food. It's because usually when we look at the aggregate and non-reported sector, and the particularity gap is low. But what your work shows is mostly non-tradable. So the tradable productivity is large, and as a result, including manufacturing, which suggests that the poor countries, they may not have a comparative advantage in non-agricultural sector, or the comparative advantage is actually quite small because of the large differences in particularly in manufacturing as well. So I think this is kind of an important fact. It's kind of in contrast to Roderick, although he didn't look at the level, but he kind of implied that the manufacturing industry will converge and tend to shrink. But what you're finding is more consistent with, sorry, this is cut off, the Cornell, Rogers, and Valentina's the recent paper. And so I guess the main difference is between formal sector, which is including, versus the whole economy, whole manufacturing sector, that includes the small and the micro firms. So these are the kind of main results. Right, seems to stop. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Okay, all right, so comments. So the one thing I wasn't sure, so when you run the regressions of TFP and basically try to see how the TFP vary for each sector, various close countries with income. But you have country sector specific factor share. So those TFPs are not directly comparable. So these are two different technologies. So I don't know how they think about that. So what I would suggest, instead of directly taking the TFP and regress on the GDP characters, you calculate the relative TFP for the reference country. So in other words, it's like when we do the growth. When you have time varying factor shares, and when you try to do the growth rate, right? So what you do is you're looking at the beginning year and end year factor shares, and they calculate the TFP and take the geometric. Right? So here we do the same thing, but from one country to another. So you use the reference country share, the factor shares to calculate the TFP, and for both countries, and use the counter that you're interested in the share to calculate for both, and then you take the relative one. So I think that, so what would that do? How does it different from the standard view measure? Basically, the different effective depends. So basically, you be the input with the factor share differences at exponent. So you need to control for some of the technology differences. So I thought maybe this would be a better way than regressing instead of regress on GDP. Say let's use US. And then you use these and regress on the GDP relative to the US. And also this relative thing, if the factor share is the same, then it's just your TFP relative to the US and how it varies across countries. And so you'll come back to the standard one, just normalize like the relative. So I think that would be possible to control the sum of this technology differences and then combine with factor differences. Yes, once you do. So the second one is regarding its importance about long important observation that people can take for granted, that the non-tradables in the sectors differences are small. I guess why they're small? Part of the justification is that there's just not much room for productivity growth in some of these non-tradable sectors. And so, but there's some recent work, for example, by Fan Peters and Zilbati, and also some follow-up on India, some follow-up on China. What they show is that some of these consumer services, actually productivity growth are very rapid. And so, and they show this, not only use the national accounts data, but because it's well known that measuring the services extremely hard, and especially the non-market services. Right? So you don't have good prices, and so many of the statistical bureau they just use the cost, measure the price. That will basically give you a TLP constant, right? So what the Fan, Peters, and their body, what they did is take an alternative approach. Of course, given that you don't have good data, now you need some theory. So they have a theory about demand for services. And then use the model to do the growth economy and back out what the really growth in services. But it turns out that they confirm that the both way of measuring the property growth for consumer service, both in India and then the follow-up study by Michael Song and others in China suggests a rapid growth, in particular in consumer services. So I think we always assume that the non-favorable services has little room for growth, but I don't think we can take that for granted. Maybe it's worthwhile to try some alternative measure. So, but to summarize, I think that this is very important work that's going to provide a very useful public good for all researchers that are interested in economic development. Thank you.
Collect some
We
questions.
should have collective questions and then we can respond to all of them. I think in the interests of certainly be listening on Zoom and potential people listening to recordings of this, we ought to get people who are going to ask questions to use the microphone. So might grab your microphone too, and then use whatever this show. Other hands? Well.
Thank you. It's obviously a wonderful paper. But I think one of the considerable advantages of the paper is that it contains so many additional improvements over what was previously possible. But what the difficulty that perhaps creates is where the results that you find differ from those previously established. It's perhaps difficult to establish precisely which changes are driving the biggest changes in results. So, for example, with both changing the production function and also incorporating these sectoral PPPs and also using the new employment concept, I wonder, for example, the biggest single data advance of this paper is probably the PPPs. So it would be very interesting to see what that adds beyond the other adaptations. And I wondered if you had some idea of the relative breakdown of each contribution. And then the second short question, somewhat more provocatively, given that probably the main results are actually that previously established beliefs hold quite well, is what you've done actually show that some of the previous assumptions were not so bad? So you've got, of course, done a lot with these new contributions, but in perhaps doing so, shown that it's not always necessary to make all of these adjustments. Thank you.
Francisco Pereira, great paper, and again, I second people. Thank you for this and all the great contribution before. So I have a question on the literature. My reading of Shen Kino 2007 is that there's more consistent than what you made sound with your result, that the conclusion is that the big differences in productivities are in tradable sectors. So that I will understand how they.
Well,
Joe Bust. Nice to meet you.
I have a question about the inefficient labor allocation, which is that, for some countries you have capital allocations, but you guys are using labor force related census. So for, I would guess most of them, you're gonna have some measure of at least of human capital differences across sectors, average human capital differences. And how much can those potentially explain? That would be a very alternative idea than inefficient labor allocation.
Go ahead and we'll go to the second round.
Right, thanks. First of all, thanks for the comments in the discussion. Maybe as a first part, so if you have differences, different factor shares across countries, how do you account for that? And well, our approach is a bit similar to this in the sense that that each country has its own shares, and if you assume that there's a translation production function that can rationalize these different factor shares, then you can compare them sort of in the middle. You can take the average shares between one country and the other, and in that way compare these two countries with each other. So you do get into I say the type of superlative indices that Irving Ewart popularized, but I think that problem is, I think, fairly well dealt with, even though I grant you that this is for those that are eager to get into index numbers, and that's not a very large group of people. But I think that issue is covered in a way that many would say is satisfactory. Now, one remark indeed that you made about Shane Lino, that also echoed by Paco, and that you probably said more about how we should present this, is indeed that Shane Lino also distinguished between investment in equipment and investment in structures. And that's probably a fairer way for us to do it as well, because indeed investment in equipment, production of equipment is very geographically concentrated. That hasn't changed. Manufacturing prices are very similar. So law of one price is going to hold more. Productivity differences are going to be a bigger factor. So that's, and while on the other hand, you have structures, construction, TFP, and there you have a lot more scope for price differences, and where we find less of a systematic pattern in productivity differences. So making that split between traded investment and non-traded investment is probably important in how we talk about our linked shapely now. And indeed, it could well be that the differences relative to the status quo are not as striking as they might look now. That gets us a bit closer to what Callum is referring to. If nothing changes, why do we go through all this effort? What we did in the paper, and I didn't have a chance to show in detail, is that we did look at, what if we change only one piece of the measure? What if we go back to this, this previous approach of measurement, the Berthold and Akos approach, and then gradually make one change at a time? As mentioned, so what we see then is that at every step, something changes, as you might imagine, but also that you get the biggest shifts once you move away from efficient labor allocation. But of course, the change in PPPs also matters in helpful ways. well, the remark by Joe is in a way, well, why didn't you go further? And, well, I fully agree that it's possible to go further, and well, I know that in Doug's work on agriculture, they also did the human capital in agriculture versus non-agriculture, so that is certainly feasible. Similarly, for capital, the more can be done than what we have done, and yeah, so in that sense, I think there's certainly ways to go on this. Also, in terms of, well, what can further be done, I'll certainly look more closely into this this contribution. I can't give a more substantive response to that than this at the moment. So thank you for that suggestion. So I think I've covered everybody's remarks, hopefully in a satisfactory way.
Thank you. I think that was true, and then now here I have a comment. I'm Tammy McGavick. I'm at Cornell College in the US. This is out of my wheelhouse in terms of macro modeling and things, but I'm wondering, to some extent, what we're talking about is a relative to an efficient allocation assumption, but allocation of labor in developing countries is not efficient for reasons related to credit constraints and insurance market incompleteness and things like that. And so I'm wondering to what extent there's room for thinking about what closes these gaps with respect to those constraints, relaxing assumptions of the model.
Yeah. No, so I think that's important. So we indeed know. I mean, the work of Arthur Lewis was emphasizing that the surplus labor in agriculture. Of course, we've moved on a long way from there, and so assuming efficient labor allocation isn't helpful, and using actual data as we do in this paper, it gets us a step closer. I know that Joe, for instance, is also working on making some of these the different types of wedges, the different inefficiencies, making those more explicit than perhaps we are able to in this marginal productive labor chart. So I think if we leaning further into this, into these macro models, can make it even more explicit how bad some of these distortions are.
To keep the science, thank you for the paper. I want to ask you about these tradable versus non-tradable services measurement. To what extent this is driven by policy, in the sense that when you were speaking, if I'm correctly, you did measure what's tradable via how much they're exporting or alike. But this could be driven by policy versus how inherently the service itself is tradable or not.
No. So that's certainly true. So that's why we, so in part, we look at these observable trade flows, which are, well, which are affected by policy. But what we also add is, and so there's been work by Brad Jensen and others on also within country clustering of production. So then if you find that production is very localized while demand is not, then that is suggestive that there's quite some scope. Then apparently trade is going on. And if you see that for services industries like for goods industries, then it must be that these services industries are also traded. So that's so we base our classification also on that type of measures. All right. Well, thank you so much for this discussion.
Probably move it, like we need to,
Okay, thank you. Okay, hi, thank you for including in the program. My name is Lucia Casal. I'm a fifth-year student at Cornell University, and I will present today joint work with Julieta Caunedo that, as the paper, as the title suggests, it will discuss about investment and economic development. So the motivation for this paper relies on a very old discussion in the economic development literature that asks what is the best investment strategy to boost economic development. So is it better to do a big push, like a broadly coordinated strategy that spans a variety of sectors in the economy? Or is it better to do like a targeted investment strategy that just targets sectors that are very well connected to other sectors in the economy? So despite the importance of this discussion in the literature, there is still systematic cross-country evidence that can support either of these hypotheses that remains elusive. So what we're going to do in this paper, we will try to argue that there is a key ingredient to answering this question, that is the investment network. That is basically how investment flows from one sector to the other. And this investment network will be a key ingredient because it will determine the aggregate output elasticity to sectoral TFP and to terms of trade in an open economy setup. So before moving forward, let me just depict an illustration of what the investment network is. So here there is the matrix. The rows of this matrix represent how investment is produced by each sector in the economy. And the columns represent how investment is used by each sector in the economy. So in that sense, the investment network represents how investment flows from one sector to the other. So let's consider, for example, the green row. This will represent how ICT is the relevance of ICT as a provider of investment to other sectors in the economy. So if many sectors rely on ICT, then the sum of this row will be very high, otherwise it will be low. Let's not focus on the orange column. This means how the total expenditures of investment in the transportation sector is allocated to other sectors. So basically it will mean how the allocation of investment expenditures in investment in transportation is allocated to electronics, ICT, and so on. And we will express the investment network in terms of expenditure share so that the columns will sum to 1. So now that I told you what the investment network is, let me tell you about this paper. So what we first do is we build a dynamic small open economy multi-sector model where there are linkages across capital types. There are also intermediate input linkages. So this will be like the core theory that disciplines the relationship between the investment network and the aggregate output elasticities to sectoral TFP and to terms of trade in an open economy setup. But for today's talk, I will focus on the closed economy setup. So then what we're going to do is we will construct the first cross-country systematic harmonized investment networks for different countries at different stages of development. And this will be the main empirical contribution of the paper. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to follow a methodology that is similar to the methodology of the BES for the US. And so far, until now, the estimates of the production of the investment network that are available is just for the US or for a handful of OECD economies, but it's not clear how comparable they are across countries. So what we're going to do is, again, we will follow this methodology that is taken to one of the BA in the US. And for now, the coverage that we have is 22 countries with income per capita that goes between 1,400 and 112,000 constant PPP dollars. And for 14 of those countries, noticeably for South Korea, we have estimates of the investment network that go back to 1965. So, and the good news is that more countries are coming. We keep updating the data set as we gain access to more data and as we harmonize data across countries. So, last, what we're going to do is armed with this investment network and with our structural model, we will document systematic disparities in the investment network across the development spectrum. And what we do is like an income accounting exercise to try to quantify how differences in the investment network can explain income differences in our sample. So our main findings on the theory side, we describe output elasticity to sectoral TFP as a function of the investment of the primitives of the model that are basically the investment network and its interaction with the input-output network, but also the allocation of the sectoral expenditure shares will play an important role. So based on the production linkages literature, we will call this output elasticities to sectoral TFP the sectoral influence vectors. And for those of you who are familiar with the literature, a feature of the model is that the influence vector will differ from the Domar weight, and this difference will stem from the dynamic of the capital accumulation of the model and not from the existence of distortions as in the paper of Ernest Yu. Perhaps more importantly, quantitatively, we document systematic disparities in the influence vector as countries develop. So, for example, we found a steady increase in the role in the influence of construction and ICT, and we find a ham-shaped influence in transportation and machinery, and more related to the sectors that are usually studied in the structural transformation literature. Reassuringly, we find that there is a decline in the influence of agriculture as countries develop, there is a ham-shape in manufacturing, and an increase in the influence of services. But all these disparities are explained by differences in the allocation of final expenditure shares, and I will show that they don't come from the structure of the investment. Great. So before I move on, and just in case I don't have time to cover all the ground, let me talk a little bit about the results that are more related to the discussion that motivated the paper. So first, should we target investment or not? So what we observe in the data is that for countries with low income, there aren't like that many disparities across the influence vector across sectors. And for countries with high income, there is a lot of heterogeneity of this influence vector across sectors. And although we have in the structural model, we have an efficient economy, so there is no room for policy, we take this as suggestive evidence that targeted investment may work better in high income economies than in poor economies. Second, we ask if there are like any particular features of the investment network that are desirable in terms of development. So what we do is we try to impose alternative investment networks to try to proxy for different types of technologies that countries may use to produce. So for example, when we imposed the investment network of the US in 1948, which we proxy for like an older technology, we find that poorer economies will benefit more from this type of investment network, whereas if we impose an investment network of the US in 2014, which we proxy for a newer technology types, we find that richer economies will benefit relatively more from this alternative investment group. Yes. No, this is intro. Like, this is like a summary of the main results, just in case I cannot get into all the details, but I will get through all these details. So if there are no questions so far, let me tell you what I'm going to talk about today. First, I will briefly present in a nutshell the multi-sector model that we construct to run the income accounting. Second, I will talk more extensively about how we measure these investment networks empirically. Third, I will provide systematic differences, characterize systematic differences in the investment network in the development spectrum. And fourth, I will talk about some implications for economic development, that is what you were asking. So let me briefly talk about the model. So we have a model with n sectors with constant returns to scale technology, where they use capital, labor, and intermediate inputs in production. Production is a composite of value-added and intermediate inputs used. The value-added composite use capital and labor, and what characterizes the model is that within each sector, there is a capital law of motion accumulation that basically states that capital in a sector N in period T+1 will depend on investment in period T and also on the undepreciated capital in period T. And this investment within the sector will be a composite of investment that is sourced from all other sectors in the economy. So basically, investment in sector XAN, which is investment that is sourced from sector N, investment in sector N that is sourced from sector I, and so on. And basically, the investment network will be represented by a matrix omega, with the typical element being this little omega that represents the expenditure shares of investment in each economy, and that will sum to 1. The model also has intermediate inputs, like as in standard models of production linkages. So sectors produce by sourcing intermediate input from all the other sectors in the economy, and the input-output network will be represented by a matrix M, which typical element will be mu, and also the mu's will sum to 1. In terms of the feasibility, output in each sector can be either used as consumption of intermediaries used by other sectors, or by investment in other sectors. And finally, we have a final consumption that is characterized by household with a Cobb-Douglas type of utility. So like value-added expenditure shares will sum to 1. So let me characterize value-added in equilibrium in this economy. So aggregate value-added will be characterized by an influence vector that I will come into in a second, and it will depend on a TFP, on the sectoral vector of sectoral TFP, and another element that in equilibrium will also depend on TFP that empirically we can measure through the distribution of employment and the government in equilibrium. But this sectoral influence, that is like the important element to understand, the output elasticity to sectoral TFP will basically depend on the investment network, on the input-output network, and also on the final expenditure share. And here the gammas represents the value-added share in gross output, and the alphas represent the capital shares in value-added. This is basically the model in a nutshell, and this is the kind of the output and elasticities that we will be measuring in the data to try to understand how disparities in these influence vectors can explain disparities in income in these economies. Yeah, this is what, so this in equilibrium will depend on TFP as well. But in terms of like how we can measure it in the data, first it's quantitatively almost 0. So all the differences will come from this vector of sectoral TFP. But empirically, you can show that it can be measured through the employment differences in the employment, so the employment sectoral employment distribution, and this is like the equilibrium Domar way. But again, quantitatively, this term will be like almost 0, and all the income will be explained by the sectoral TFPs multiplied by this influence vector. Are there more questions? Okay, so let me now expand on how do we construct these investment networks for different countries at different stages of development. So the goal here is to, again, to determine how much of the new capital that is produced by each sector is used by each other sector in the economy. So how do we do this? So for equipment sectors, we will do an imputation approach that is similar to the one that the BEA implements to construct the investment network for the US. So the way they do it is to make, or the way we do it is to make capital allocation to be proportional to the sectoral occupational distribution in the economy. So in the BEA, this assignment is ad hoc, and how they do it is not publicly available. The way we do it is to use to follow the tools used on the job by each occupation, following the paper, the recent paper by Caunedo and others. And I will be more clear about the details of the methodology in the next slide. But for the sectors that are not equipment sectors, for which we cannot determine how tools are used on the job, what we assume is that we assign the capital to be proportional to intermediate impulse use. So let me put you an example of how this methodology works. Suppose you have $100 that are produced of investment in the ICT sector, and you want to allocate it in manufacturing and investment. So now consider the occupation distributions within each sector. So consider that there are 100 managers in manufacturing and 200 mechanics in manufacturing, but there are 300 managers in services and 200 mechanics in services. So services is more managers intensive than manufacturing. Let's now consider how much ICT equipment each occupation use on the job. So let's consider that, say, managers use 3 computers to work. Each manager uses 3 computers, but each mechanic uses only 1 computer. And this is the same for manufacturing and for services. That gives you the total amount of, say, ICT equipment or computers that are used by managers in manufacturing and by mechanics in manufacturing, which sums to 500 computers used in manufacturing. But it also gives you how many computers are used by managers within services and by mechanics within services. So this gives you 1,100 computers used by services. So basically you have 600 computers used in the economy, 31% of which are used by the manufacturing sector, 69% of which are used by the services sectors. And this is what we do to allocate how investment production is used by each other sector in the economy. So the counterpart in the investment, in the capital flows table, will be that the use of ICT by the manufacturing sector will be $31, and the use of ICT by the services sector will be $69. So we can then repeat the exercise for different types of equipment, which will give us the total expenditure in investment by manufacturing and by services. And basically, the investment network, what they do is what we do is we express it in terms of expenditure shares. So basically, the columns will sum to 100%. Yeah. Yeah, it's not the same technology. It's that managers, the assumption would be that managers within manufacturing use the same amount of tools, or sorry, the same amount of computers that managers in the service sector. That is the assumption that we use. That is the counterpart that we can use based on the estimates of Caunedo's paper. Okay. Are there more questions? Okay, so now let me tell you where do we source all these elements from the data. So the investment production by sector for countries sub-Saharan Africa that we have so far is Ethiopia and Ghana. The data was kindly provided by Mensa and Debris, and more countries are coming. So that's very good news for us. And for the other countries, we source it for the world input output data. Then, as I explained before, the number of tools by worker in each occupation is sourced by the estimation by Caunedo's paper and co-authors, where they estimate the number of tools that each occupation use on the job. And here the identification assumption will be that the intensity of equipment used between occupations will be the same across countries. Back to the example, what this means is that we have to assume, given the restrictions, the data availability that we have, is that managers across countries use the same number of computers, and mechanics across countries use the same number of computers. That doesn't mean that these allocations will be the same across countries, because countries will differ in the occupation distribution within industries, and they will differ in the production of investment by each sector. Lastly, the employment by occupational sector. For Ethiopia, we source it from IPUs, international. From Ghana, we take it from the LSMS, and from other countries, we take it from PIAC. The reason that we don't take it from IPUs is that we get more granular distribution of occupations within industries. So there is a lot of effort in harmonizing all these data across countries, and we're still working on putting more countries together. We assume that the allocation of investment is proportional to the input-output structure, and we sort this input-output from the same sources of the production of investment, so from Mensa and Debris, and for the world input-output data. So what this gives us is investment networks that are estimated for 22 countries 2 of which are from Sub-Saharan Africa, and again, there are more to come. The Sub-Saharan Africa we have from 1990 to 2019, and for 14 countries, we have estimates that go back to 1965, and for other 6 countries, we have estimates that go since 2000. Okay. So, if there are no questions, let me characterize systematic disparities of this investment. Yeah. Yeah, so this is an assumption that we have to make. But again, like cross-country differentiation, so this is based on data restrictions, but cross-country differentiation will also come. So the differences in the occupation distribution within industries across country will kind of like speak for heterogeneity in the production technologies across economies. So in that sense, like differences in quality might be reflected of the occupational distribution that is used within an industry across sectors. But I'm happy to talk later about it. Okay, so let me now document systematic disparities in the investment network across the development spectrum. So here, let me just illustrate the investment network for South Korea in 1965, where its income per capita was 1,400, and in 2014, where its income per capita went up by 25 times. So what you can see is like back in 1965, construction and services were star providers of investment in the economy, whereas in 2014, they declined their importance, and ICT and transportation services become more important providers of investment in the economy. This is just an illustration. Let me just characterize this more systematically by showing you the investment network out degrees of this economy. So the I degrees is basically the sum of the rows in the investment network, and it measures how important is a sector as a provider of investment to other sectors. What we can see here is that as countries develop, ICT becomes a more important provider of investment, and also transportation becomes a more important provider of investment. So let me now talk about how the implications of these differences in the investment network for economic development. So what we're going to do is first we're going to run an income accounting exercise where we're trying to document how differences in investment network across countries could explain income differences. And we're going to run some counterfactual analysis considering different counterfactual economies. And second, we will try to implement alternative investment networks, basically the investment network of the US in 1948 as proxy of an old technology, and the investment network of the US in 2014 as a proxy of a newer technology, and see how countries at different stages of development do when we impose these alternative networks, while we keep all other features of the country specific. And third, and last, we're gonna try to assess the heterogeneity in the sectoral influence sectors in the development spectrum, and try to provide first answers, preliminary answers to the discussion that motivated the paper on what is the best investment strategy to boost economic development. Let's see. Am I doing okay with time?
Got 8 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So let me first go through the income accounting. So here I'm showing how much of the model-based income is explained by TFP. That is not surprisingly, it's like 100%. So let's focus on the orange column. But then we run some counterfactual analysis to consider counterfactual economies. So if we consider an economy without links at all, so without investment network and without production network, we find that this explains only 36% of the model-based income. So basically, the other 70%, 74% is explained by linkages in this economy. Let us now consider an economy only with production linkages. In that case, we will explain 76% of the model-based income, which means that the input-output linkages explain 40% of the income, model-based income. And lastly, so the remaining 24% must be explained by the investment network either directly or indirectly through its interaction with the input-output network. So basically, to measure the direct impact, we consider an economy only with investment links, and we see that it only explains 4% of difference from the economy without links. So this means that almost all the impact of the investment network to explain model-based income is explained by the interactions of the investment network with the production. Okay, now let me show you the exercise where we try alternative investment networks. So on the right, we see what is the income differences related to the baseline of imposing the US investment network in 1948. And what we can see is that poorer economies benefit more from this proxy of this older technology, whereas high-income economies do not benefit at all. On the other hand, if we impose the investment network of the US in 2014 as a proxy of a newer technology, we can see that in this case, high-income economies will benefit way more from these like newer technologies. So this is just kind of like an empirical characterization. It would be, the interesting question would be to find out why is this? Are these like given by complementarities between the investment network and the production network? Are these given by distortions in this economy? Or are these given by a story about comparative advantage? So more work will come on that side. So lastly, let me talk about, again, the discussion that motivates the paper on whether what is the best strategy to boost economic development. So here what we show is the variance of the sectoral influence vectors for the equipment and construction sector within a country. So basically, for poorer economies, the influence vector is more similar across countries, but for richer economies, there is more heterogeneity in the sectoral influence across sectors. So although we have an efficient economy in our structural model, so there is no room for policy, we take this as empirical suggestive evidence that targeting investment may be more beneficial in richer economies than in poorer economies. And as a matter of fact, this heterogeneity is mostly driven by ICT sector. If there are no questions, I will conclude. So we basically build the first cross-country harmonized estimates of the investment network across countries for different stages of development, and more countries are coming up. Second, we document the role of this income, the role of these differences in the investment network for income disparities. And last, and in model-based, we show that it's not only the investment network that matters, but also the interaction between the investment network and the production network and the allocation of final expenditure shares, which matters to explain how the aggregate output elasticity of to sectoral EFPs. And again, like the following work will relate to trying to understand why do we observe these patterns, or what are kind of like the drivers or the nature of these changes, and we hope that we can contribute on that road. So thank you.
Thank you for asking me to study this paper. I learned a lot, and it's a great paper. It's an important paper also. It's a paper that has careful measurement and creative measurement. So I praise the author. I encourage to to keep going on this work. So the key question is, you see the paper is asking the question, how does the investment network change with development? Provide interesting, very interesting factors that they mentioned. What is the investment network? Lucia explained this very clearly, but to give you a little bit of a summary, tell you the question of which sector produce capital, and more importantly, for which sector they produce it. It's often referred to as the capital flow table if we use to the US language. Although, so for some more recent work, I've been looking for capital flow tables across countries, and it's shocking me how we know. So that's what makes this paper a very important paper. And when you start searching for, say, capital flow tables for say for India, for developing countries, you just only thing you're gonna get is capital flow data that's in international finance. So basically, you get zero information. They also provide a normal measurement across countries and over time. They give us data for going from very poor economies like Ethiopia to the US from the 60s to the teens. And also the last part of the paper, they put it to use with a simple theoretical framework, do some income accounting. This is the part I would be less sure that we necessarily learn a lot. But we will try to propose ways to do more. We're going to do the discussion. We're going to discuss a little bit of peer contribution. I think that is very important. And then we'll try to ask the question, why is information important? We'll try to illustrate this. Lucia and Julieta have done some of that. We'll review a little bit of the theoretical framework in the paper, and I will propose an alternative theoretical framework to motivate the facts. Yeah.
Sorry, you might hold the
Oh, sorry.
like,
Yeah.
but hold your mouth. There you go.
More importantly, am I speaking clearly?
That one I cannot do. I should get some singing classes. Okay, so the imperial contributions. Surprisingly, there's very little know about this for investment network. For the US, even from the US, you have available data for 3 years. I guess there is data for another 4 years. You look at archive paper publications, and obviously it's much less known about other countries, especially poor countries. What they also do is using information of occupational composition by industry, plus information, the tools used by different occupations, plus other proxies to construct investment network. You will think about that as a shocking thing to do. If you go to the, and I did that because it's sort of surprising, you read the methodological documents of the BEA, and that's what they do. I will be, also a little bit unfair when they say they do adopt imputation. I suspect that the BA has to be doing something similar to the author, even though they don't report. So I would suggest that they write to the BA office and they do the investment network, even though they haven't updated recently. But and the BA is, I mean, they're super nice for answering questions that we provided to them. I guess part of the public mandate. And I was at the Chicago Fed, and we do that. We always do some policy work, and they go all the way to us. So I'm sure that they have done something similar, and it would be nice to inform us about that. They think recently already worked on that. They mentioned this work by Von Lehm and Wimbury. They use asset data by sector. I suspect that the asset data by sector uses similar measurement. That would be curious to see how that is done. Von Lehm and Wimbury, they provide a yearly investment network for the US from back to the 40s. and they kind of extend it to ICT and so on and so forth. And they work, they build up on Julieta's work on measuring the CEPC by occupation. I will also be given this shocking simple method that authors and the VA use to be nice to validate the results with more direct measures on asset capital use by sectors. Some information about that can be obtained from survey data. The ASI in India has that information, and also for recent work by Boehm and Overfield document interesting fact about how the input-output structure at the firm level changes with the size of the firm. Like, that direct measure would be nice to get. But Greta showed this give you a sense of, I mean, the way the key fact of the paper I take away is that they document how this investment network is changing with development in a systematic way, in an interesting way. My interpretation of that is that they show us evidence on how the adoption of modern capital embedded technologies is taking place over the development process. So that will be my key reading of the paper, what these new measurements tell us about. So that relate to some facts and theories by, as I said before, by Boehm and Overfield, documenting how the input use, the way of production, organization of production take place over the size of the firms, the productivity of the firms. Some of that can be understood as changing our development process. Some work by Youngs and co-authors that kind of give a series of that process. So they propose a simple framework. Think about this fact. I think my readings are building up on Forster, Sartre, Watson, and authors to give us an economy, a simple production economy with an input-output structure that's going to be the with M matrix and an investment network with the capital omega network matrices. And I guess the way I'm writing this up is I'm ignoring the fact that factor intensity might change the across sectors. They also in the quantitative analysis assume more factor intensities, and we just ignore these differences to make it the presentation a little bit ugly. In this simple framework, what you get is that I guess you can get two simple results. You can get a result of how, say, welfare changes with productivity at the sectoral level in the steady state. To get a simple expression, it's going to be useful to get the case where no discounting. And in this case, you get that the influence vector is going to be an extended Jeff inverse. But not only you have 1 minus the IO structure, but you have also minus the investment network. In the model, I guess in the steady state, at the investment network, you can think of capital as another intermediate input. So you're going to get an expanded one IO matrix. And the result will be exact. You are in the non-discounting case. In the case of discounting, you have to take into account this intertemporal Euler equation to get not the right expression. I guess related to the long run effect, you have the short run effect will be less important because you don't want to have this further effect of intermediate of the capital multiplier. Will be interesting to understand a little bit of results in the dynamic. I guess the others can maybe explore that. I will argue that given the facts that are documented by the author, I will say that a more interesting framework will be a framework where there is a technology adoption margin. I mean, the results spring to the fact that it seems to be that poor countries are using different technologies. So I guess a simple extension of the framework they consider, we have a framework where there is some heterogeneity on the output produced of each set by the firm in a sector, and there's a potential technology choice between maybe more traditional and more modern technologies, and importantly, the modern technologies is capital embedded. So in this framework, and I think that to adopt the modern technology, you need to purchase some investment groups. And you can think of a very similar structure where they're going to be, the output is produced with intermediate inputs, and but the capital is the cost that you use to choose a better technology that is more productive. And then the investment, this cost of technology adoption is itself required input from other sectors and is given by this this investment. Importantly, in a framework like this, there you have imperfect competition, you're going to have a natural role for policy because there's going to be a market distortion. There will be, in principle, homogeneous across sectors, but because there's going to be this interesting investment or adoption network and IO networks will imply very sector-specific policies. So you can work out simple expressions for what is going to be the impact of a policy in welfare. Here, these are going to be, think about a revenue subsidy that could be different by various sector. And you're going to have an expression of the impact of this policy. They're going to have a more of a static impact that's going to be given by the difference between a forward and a backward donor weight. That's going to be similar to the result by Kefari and Liu. And you're going to have more of a productivity effect, and think of a dynamic effect that will have to do with the fact that policies affects adoption, and adoption affects the productivity of the sector. And importantly, the effect of that term will be mediated by this capital omega matrix, the investment network that Lucia and Julieta measure for us. So to understand, and that's the key, the motivation of the paper. The motivation of the paper is which sectors should be targeted to promote investment and so on and so forth. And that's what the expression of this sort will give you. So in this, particularly in this framework, there will be, because of the non-convexities associated with this duality in technologies, you're going to have these very strong complementarities. And you see that by the fact that you're going to have not only, as in the simpler model, you have this extended Jontier inverse, you're going to have this double Jontier inverse. So you're going to have a Jontier inverse that is kind of get to be inverted again. And this has to do with the fact that policies promote adoption, lower the cost of adoption to the sector, the further promotes adoption, and so on and so forth. So you're going to get a much stronger complementarity in the simple model. We have this more continuous capital use. So an example of that is you can work out what is the ranking of sectors that you want to more priority to least priority sectors. You can do the ranking in a simple production economy with no adoption, and can do the ranking when you include adoption, include the type of measurement that Lucia bring to the table, and you see important differences. In particular, here you're going to have sectors that become more priority, come up in the ranking. That those are the sectors like computers, transportation, machinery, professional services that embedded a lot of the ICT sector. So this is the type of this is an illustration of why matters to have this type of measurement. Yeah.
Did you say what drives the adoption technology that moves those ones down?
No,
How do you
no,
identify the next?
no, the fact that you're incorporating this. So think about the x-axis would be the ranking based on this term only. The other axis is the ranking when you incorporate this more dynamic sort of endogenous technology adoption margin. The fact that policy not only improve the static allocation by maybe getting more intermediate use and so on and so forth, but also change the type of technology they're going to be used, and through that improve the productivity of the sector and the sectors.
But what empirically guides that second?
But no, the
What doesn't cover one?
I know the fact that investment network are going to have more, I guess, more, what's the word? More,
Influence.
no, the central, no.
Central.
It's more used by many sectors in more upstream. Yeah. So it matters a lot that this omega matrix is different from this M matrix. Otherwise, you're gonna have just a pure amplification of what you're gonna affect. It's gonna be larger, but you're not gonna necessarily affect who you should be promoting and so forth. I mean, we presented a version of this paper last year in the tech conference, and they were not using the investment network and natural reaction people were well, but this kind of ranking doesn't seem to be make sense given the adoption. Okay, so let me. Okay, no. But again, so getting closer to concluding, let me summarize the points I was making. This is, let me say that it's an important paper with careful and creative measurement. It's important we bring this important new data that so shockingly we knew very little about. I happen to be interested in that, and so I happen to be facing the fact that there was not much of this information. I will encourage the authors to focus on expanding the set of content periods, sharpen and focus in vehicle function. I think that the authors, and it show up a little in the presentation and motivation, are pushing themselves too hard in the moment when I say something about which sector to promote or not. And I think the paper will be a great paper if they provide us with this new set of data across countries, and already kind of they're already showing these interesting facts. The way I will read the facts is they're going to be providing evidence on changes of the technology being used for development. Just by doing that and documenting that very clearly will be a great paper. I think the current data that try to overinterpret their findings, and they're doing that by having they're working with a framework that is efficient and try to draw conclusions about what's the right policy intervention, and that obviously it doesn't make any sense to do it with the framework at hand. I don't think they have to. And they don't have to tell us, look, I'm going to show you this new measurement, and I'm going to give you the perfect model to do the perfect policy. That's asking too much for one paper. And it will be great that you're going to document these facts and clearly well done. Facts papers are really important. And doing that very, very well is super hard, and I know the authors, and I know they're very careful scholars. So then just focus on that and not try to do too much. I mean, I think it would be useful to have a simple structure illustration, and they can pick, and you can do some of that with the framework, but just focus on one simple structure interpretation. How to solve the world poverty problem at the same time. I think that would take us much more than one paper and much more than one set of authors. Thank you very much.
Like questions now, and then we will do the question.
I guess it's partly clarifying question and partly comment. One of the patterns you showed is that at low levels of development, there's less variation in, this is a clarifying question, there's less variation across industries. But then when you show the early Korea one, then it just seems to be like, yeah, there's a huge difference. It's just like construction and everything else. So I couldn't kind of reconcile, is Korea an outlier in that, or am I just misunderstanding things? That's a clarifying question. And then the comment is, I wonder whether some of this variation is just that like the way we write up classification systems, sectoral classification systems, biased for rich countries, where there will be, in 1945 in the US, you wouldn't have had an ICT as an accounting sector. Maybe there's the sectors that are really important to distinguish between. For a low-income country, we just all lump it together and say agriculture, when it's really about, modern agriculture and traditional agriculture or something like that. That's the comment.
Great paper and great presentation. I was just wondering if you have thought about the role of the external environment in documenting some of these facts. I'm thinking when Korea was on its development path and grew, the external environment was very different than when Bangladesh is sort of making its development trajectory. And so the changes in the investment network that we are thinking about, is it completely immune to what is happening in the world? And it's purely about development, or does globalization, things like that have a role to play?
Thank you. My question is a little bit related to that of Joe, in that you have quite different time periods with different sets of countries under analysis, and particularly much shorter time periods for the developing countries, but then the final results with different income classes are collapsed across the time period. So I wondered to what extent these patterns might just be a result of changing technologies over time, rather than variation between income classes.
Yeah, I think I'm Mehmet Fatih from Koç Üniversitesi İstanbul. I also have some clarifying questions. Papa talked about statistics. I'm not sure if you are making some statistical calculations, but if we go think about statistics, then depreciations are gonna matter in investment decisions. And depreciations are different across different sectors. We see technology, they achieve 3 to 5 years, and it may matter, and depreciation may matter. And also, while thinking about comparing at the cross section, comparing different countries at different income or development levels, instead of comparing them at the cross section, can you drag them to times such that you can see per capita income, PPE adjusted per capita income. Let's say it's $10,000 PPE for Egypt in 2005, while it is $10,000 PPE adjusted for Turkey in 2010. Then comparing 2010 Turkey or with Egypt, because my gut feeling is that technologies may have a one-to-one mapping between the income levels or development levels. I don't know, maybe it can be a different path to test and check.
I think we should do the typical So why don't you go back up?
Great, so thank you so much for all the comments. First, thank Paco for such a great discussion. I shall make a few comments on discussion. I think first, related to the Forster paper, I just wanted to emphasize the importance that we have the open economy version of the model, especially in light of the fact that we are considering a lot of developing economies for which imported capital plays a crucial role. But then it's great the suggestion of adopting a model with technological choice that will be speaking better for the empirical facts, and also I won't take it about the overinterpretation of the facts. But also you make also a very important point that I was maybe not clear about, that is very important in the paper, that empirically the investment network looks very different than the input-output network, and that is why measuring this type of flows is also important for development. But thank you so much. So related to the question, related to Joe's question, that is a great point. Actually, there are two different things. So one is the out degree of the investment network. Let me see if I can. So the out degree measures like the roles of the investment, the sum of the roles of the investment network. So how important is a sector as a provider of investment to other sectors in the economy? For the case of this graph, what I was showing is the variance in the influence vector. And that is kind of why the theory is important. Because the influence vector is not only affected by the investment network itself, but also by the interaction of the investment network with the input-output structure and the allocation of the final expenditure shares. So actually, I think I have this here. If you take a look at the differences in the influence vector across the development, you can see that they look very different, the patterns with respect to the out degrees of the investment network. So these are two different elements. So what I mean when I show the differences in the sectoral variance is differences in the sectoral variance of the influence vector and not of the out degrees of the investment network.
Quick follow-up, just to clarify more. Could you give like a concrete example, say like construction?
Yes.
Had a big out degree, at least at low income for Korea.
Yes.
And now it has
like a hump shape for the influence vector.
yeah, but just that 0.06 is kind of small. So what is it again that makes?
So what is like in the theory, let me be more clear. So in the theory, the one of the pictures of Korea are showing the sum of the rows only of this omega matrix. For the other table and for the picture of the variation across countries, what we're showing is all these elements.
Yeah, I'm trying to get like a simple example. You're telling me the math is more complicated.
Yeah, no, but right. So basically, exactly, the final expenditure shares are driving, the fact that, say, poorer countries have like higher expenditure shares in agriculture related to manufacturing and services is the one that is driving, yeah, sorry. Okay, so then for the sectoral classification, yeah, I completely agree. Like there are a lot of measurement issues that we need to be careful about, and that's for sure. And even like within developing economies, the fact that since the 2000s, like ICT has become like an important sector, but it wasn't before, may like kind of like contaminate a little bit the measurement as well. So for the external environment question, I think it's a very important question. So in this model, we don't have an endogenous investment network. So probably like if we consider like how the investment network would be affected by, endogenously by different factors, including external factors or even like more internal factors, then that would be like an interesting thing to explore, but we have nothing to say in the paper about that so far. But it's very interesting. And related to the question of the cross-country analysis, let me clarify that those scatter plots are only considered for the year of 2005, and this is because it's the only year for which we have measurements of BBP prices, so we can make all these measurements comparable across countries. So these are not driven by serious differences in technologies. And then for the state model question and depreciation, it's completely right what you're saying. And actually, I didn't have time to go all through all the details of the model. But one feature of the model is that in equilibrium, the dollar weights in this economy, given that you have dynamics and capital accumulation, will depend endogenously on the investment rates. So basically, in steady state, if the depreciation rate is constant, it will affect the dollar weights in the economy and the influence and basically how important are sectors or the output elasticities to sectoral activity. So this is exactly what is happening in this model. But yeah, thank you so much for all the questions, and I'm happy to chat later.
Go down to a 2-minute break. So we'll see you back here probably in forecast.
Yeah.
Okay. Let you go.
Hi.
Give him just a minute. We'll try to completely. Is there a way? Yeah,
Vivek, you can plug your slides in. In the meantime, I'll just pause it.